Now, now Norman Tebbit is being portrayed by the Daily Mail as being the opposite of evil. And the evil concerned here is the Irish Republican Army bomb explosion in the hotel where Tebbit and the other Tories were staying during a Conservative Party conference, while Margaret Thatcher was in post as the Conservative Prime Minister. Now, of course, explosion, bombing is factually responsible for the deaths of so many innocent people. And so therefore it is justifiable to call it evil. But what is the correct word for racism and racist hatred? The single word opposite to the evil of explosions and bombing of innocent people. It is also evil. Racism is evil. And racism is evil, as can be seen in the evidence of what the Nazis did in Germany and in Poland and in Austria and in France and in other places they occupied during the so-called Second World War, or the Second European War of the last century. The Nazis massacred, genocided millions of people. So that was evil. And the degree to which that evil was evil is incomparably worse, bigger than the numbers affected by the violence of the Irish Republican Army. But both are responsible for atrocities done to innocent people. So where would Norman Tebbit place himself, or where would Norman Tebbit's racist hatred, incitement, and denial place him? Definitely against the Irish bombers, but definitely behind the Nazis. And it's not far-fetched, the reference to the Nazis, when talking about the contents and the role of the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail was literally a supporter of the Nazis. So how dare the Daily Mail pretend that only the Irish bombing was evil, but the Nazi atrocities and the Nazi genocide and massacres were not. And that Tebbit, who would easily, on the basis of his role and his spewing of hatred, racist hatred, easily fit the description of a Nazi ideology supporter, racist ideology supporter, or to take a current word, strain, the racist strain of the Nazi ideology. So we condemn the Daily Mail for lying, for racists and for Nazis, and for racist massacres and genocides, while pretending otherwise. And it says, the Times says on the two-page spread, furious number 10, that is number 10 Downing Street, which is the official residence of the occupant in the post of Prime Minister at the expense of Britain. Number 10 considers lorry park tests to beat French ban. Now, there are two things there. One is that that's an admission again that Britain was not in control. Even before the Brexit is implemented, Britain is here in this piece or in this kind of reported action, behaving as if Britain was out of the EU. The basic point is that if Britain became free to take back control after and only after it got Brexit, quote, done by the undone Prime Minister Boris Johnson, that it could control the whole of its policies and behavior. Plainly, factually, it couldn't. In fact, the warning in the last few days, reported in the last few days by one of the biggest supermarkets in Britain, Sainsbury's, that if the deal was not done in order to keep business going between Britain and the rest of Europe or European countries, then there would be serious shortages, food shortages. And they highlighted in that reported particular statement of position the shortages affecting citrus and other fruits and vegetables. Now the question is, of course, that is another factual, ordinary confirmation that Brexit was completely wrongly promoted and wrongly kind of advanced and wrongly justified. Quite apart from that, this Sainsbury's themselves should have said that 5 years ago. Because as I have said earlier, if Britain could produce its own food, as the Daily Mail stupid Ross Clark is exhibited as saying today in the Daily Mail, why hasn't Britain been producing the food for centuries? So that is the kind of question that is nothing to do with ideology, party, political, or any other ideology. Basic food, basic stuff that people must have. Otherwise, there would be famine. There would be famine and there would be hunger on a much wider scale than Jacob Rees the moron mug is capable of understanding. If the size of his brain is to be measured by his stupid condemnation of the UNICEF organization offering one charitable organization in Britain money to feed hungry children in London. So these people, the Brexiteers and the current government fronted by the undone Prime Minister Boris Johnson, these are unfit for society. That does not automatically mean that their so-called opposition fronted by Keir Starmer is going to be a fit one. Because as I was saying, Keir Starmer has himself got an evil strain in his ideology, in his outlook, to the extent that he actually wants the poorest, the most vulnerable to suffer. and to be deprived even more than what they are being deprived of now. As I was saying in the previous part, the then outgoing or retiring Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer, issued a number of kind of regulations from the Crown Prosecution Service, making it easier to prosecute and penalize and imprison the poorest people, the most vulnerable people in need of help, financial help. And Keir Starmer was behaving in the same way as Ian Duncan, the Dracula Duncan Smith, was behaving and was making the government measures to fit the agenda of penalizing and punishing and driving to their suicides thousands of people in the most vulnerable financial and medical and health conditions. So although he is called a Labour leader now, Keir Starmer has got form as a very cruel, unkind and uncaring and oppressive and heartless despot who wants to penalize the poor and the poorest. So he is very much like a far right winger. He is very much like a right wing conservative of the type Norman Tebbit is. And Ian Dracula Duncan Smith is actually the constituency MP for the same constituency broadly that Norman, the Dracula Tebbit, misrepresented for too long in the northeast of London. Chingford. So in the cruelty perpetuated by the Fleet Street papers, embodied by the Daily Mail, we are saying that there is no, morally and evidentially, there is no real difference between the ideology and the outlook and the attitude of Keir Starmer and the so-called conservative embodiments of cruelty and lack of compassion and lack of humanity, as evident in the behavior and the role and the utterances of Dracula Duncan Smith and his predecessor as MP for Chingford area, Norman the Dracula Tebbit. And there is no sign in any of the papers today, Tuesday, the 22nd of December 2020, any of the Fleet Street papers today of any moral assessment of the immoral Boris Johnson-fronted government or the immoral Boris Johnson-fronted agenda of Brexiteers and Brexit. So there is no counter to the cruelty agenda being peddled by the same papers that are also shedding crocodile tears about the virus, mutant virus spreading and the tier 4 level of lockdown being imminent. They are actually promoting the idea that restricting movement and restricting kind of freedom constitutes, in the context of having to deal with the virus, taking away freedom and liberty. Now, that can be said politically in a scenario, in a context of lack of sufficient or any significant opposition to the current government and the regime, by a democracy backing, freedom advocating opposition in the UK Parliament. But there is no such opposition in the UK Parliament. I mean, Keir Starmer's reported kind of concern at the failure of the Boris Johnson-fronted cabal in dealing with the virus is too tiny, too insignificant, and too far behind the evidence, the facts. So the Starmer, when he was desperately issuing the Starner rules against the poorest and the most vulnerable, as he was leaving the Crown Prosecution Service, he wasn't behaving in isolation of the rest of his agenda, his outlook. Starmer is a grossly kind of overhyped, over-promoted person whose limitations are to be found in his lack of morality and ethics and compassion. And he's a racist. Starmer is a racist on the record because in his traveling as a career sponsored by the racists who were condemning Jeremy Corbyn for Corbyn's alleged sympathies for the rights of the Palestinians. Starmer has been sponsored by racists who like him to be silent about fighting racism. And racism, as we have been saying, on the evidence, not because we need to use that as a pretext for anything. Racism on the records is at the center of the failures of the Boris Johnson-fronted cabal to provide necessary service, necessary governance to this society as a whole, which is predominantly white. And the indigenous white majority are being let down by the corrupt, racist, incompetent, unaccountable, undemocratic, cruel, lacking in compassion regime fronted by Boris Johnson. Because all of these vices, ills, are to be found in racist outlook, racist mentality. So contrary to the belief, subliminally and brazenly foisted on the majority of the gullibles, that racists like Boris Johnson prefer them to the African and Asian people. That is not the case. The same contempt that Boris Johnson showed to the people of Liverpool is coming to be aimed at the people of Muslim origin, Muslim women or Africans, or people of other locations and islands, whom Boris Johnson condemned and insulted by calling them all kinds of names. So it's the same person, the same mentality. Now he has no right on any criteria, on any ground, to be given the opportunity that he has been given to be leader of the Conservatives, or by definition of that, or by fact of that, by dint of that, by the fact that he is the leader of the Conservative Party, prime minister of this country, become prime minister, because he is failing every day. And the contradictions outnumber any consistency that can be found by long due research in his behavior as the incumbent in the post of prime minister. And he is not in control. And the same thing is being done by Donald Trump's staff. As Boris Johnson's chief advisor and chief colluder and chief co-conspirator, Dominic Cummings, was guilty of doing, flouting the rules. So these people are not only doing it in terms of hidden narratives, they're doing it brazenly, openly, flouting the rules. And what happens when they flout the rules is the virus continues. And the virus goes out of control, because what the newspapers, Fleet Street papers, are not saying is how many stages has this virus traveled to reach the point where they are now saying it is out of control. How many stages? How many wrong things have been done? And this is the and the Times is saying, using the word fear. Now that is Rachel Sylvester saying, ministers fear 6 billion cost of Rashford's hat trick. That the footballer Marcus Rashford is saying that he won't give up until the government stages another U-turn on feeding hungry children. That is a hat trick. Now, fear is the wrong word, because the HS2 is currently costing, or the budget is for 170 billion pounds and going up. 6 billion out of 170 billion is nothing. And if they scrap the HS2, it would not only solve the hunger problem, it would solve most of the funding problems faced by the rest of the agencies and the institutions, including solving the poverty problem faced by millions of people in this country, including the people facing eviction, loss of homes. And there is a cartoon in the Times correctly mocking Keir Starmer, the moron. And there are letters headline. The main letters column is headline: Press pause on Brexit to focus on COVID-19. Now that is absolutely the correct headline, but this should have been the theme for the last 5 years. Scrap Brexit and focus on the needs of society that are being overlooked, which they have been overlooked for 5 years. And for 5 years, the media colluded with the lying for Brexit and colluded in the suppression of the evidence of unfitness and lack of preparedness by the government. And lack of accountability, lack of answerability, lack of compassion, and lack of ethics and morality. So we have been diagnosing Fleet Street for a very long time, long before even the Brexit thing was launched by the moron David Cameron. Looking at the evidence of their behavior, looking at the evidence of their kind of lack of basic competence and the lack of connection with the needs of the people and the needs of the society, it is abundantly clear that the leaders of this country, for example, from the Conservative, including the Labour, have been far behind. That is, they have been, on the whole, more ignorant than the ordinary person, stupider than the ordinary person. And the stupidity and the ignorance of Boris Johnson is, of course, the current kind of theme, current topic. But he is following other idiots as prime minister. So where is the actual evidence that the thinking, quote, educated writers on the Fleet Street papers, they are not to be found anywhere? Because they are not examining the evidence. They are not examining the evidence. And there is no column in the Times or in the Guardian or indeed in the Financial Times that they recognize a relationship between the UK government, successive UK government's failure or choice or decision to implement the various charters and rules and requirements of the agreements and conventions and the failures by the government. The assumption is, pervaded and perpetuated by Fleet Street, that government, the central UK government, by providing any kind of decree, tier, lockdown, whatever, is doing the people a favor. Now that is the opposite of what it should be. But the newspapers, the Fleet Street newspapers, are not on the evidence of their history. Going back to 230 years in the case of the Times and the others, hundreds of years, let's say. On the evidence of hundreds of years of contents by the Fleet Street papers, they are not the organs, the platforms, the places, the spaces for telling the news to suit the evidence and to suit the rights and the demands that exist among the people and society. So Fleet Street newspapers being diagnosed by us is not a kind of peripheral, subsidiary, or less than central kind of action. It is the central action, because these are the organs that are seen and are affected by and do affect the people. Seen by and affect the people, much more people than anything that Parliament does or says in terms of the daily kind of offerings. For example, if there is a bill that is put for vote by MPs, it is done in a very short kind of time, and it's mainly exhibited as MPs being divided by the two options, yes or no, voting yes or no. And it doesn't contain anything like the details or even the summary of the truthful summary of the contents. Whereas newspapers, despite the fact that they are vehicles of lies and lying, newspapers contain details of the contents of the lying pieces. So they have the attention of the people far longer than the people have the time for MPs, and the MPs are available to be examined by the people anyway. MPs are not available to be scrutinized or examined by the people, not by their own particular constituency voters or by any part of the rest of the population. So democracy is currently in a state of real failure, and there is no alternative. There is no democratic alternative to the current failed kind of version. As we have said, Keir Starmer is not a Democrat. Keir Starmer is an ignorant person and a prejudiced person and a selfish, petty-minded person. A person who is very cruel. Despite the propaganda insertion about his concern for the well-being of his mother, he has not been concerned for the well-being of other people's mothers in poverty, in hardship, in bad health, and so on. So when he was promoting the harsher kind of rules to penalize the poorest people and the people in the most vulnerable positions, as he was about to leave the Crown Prosecution Service as the Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer was actually endorsing Dracula Duncan Smith's policy that led to the thousands of people being forced to commit suicide, forced by withdrawal of financial support and benefits by the deprivation, want creation, and poverty creation department, otherwise known as DWP. So we call that a massacre of the poorest. Massacre by government policy executed through the DWP, deprivation, want, and poverty creation. Massacre of the poorest, massacre of the most vulnerable. Now this is the thing that happened before the June 2017 massacre of the Grenfell Tower residents. We have explained, stated in detail in previous editions why we call, and we have been calling this massacre right from the beginning. Because the building, the actual physical structure, the building that the Grenfell Tower stands surrounded by open spaces on all sides, which means that military helicopter could easily be scrambled, carrying water and pouring water on the building that was ablaze. This wasn't done. And the blaze went on for hours. And no rescue planes or helicopters, military helicopters, were scrambled, which should have been done, which could have been done. And that is why it is massacre, because nobody has raised this question as far as we can see. If there is any evidence that anyone can find, we shall be interested to look at the evidence that anyone else has said this same thing from the beginning of the 17th of June 2017. Up to now, we have been continuing to call it the massacre. So that massacre happened in 2017. And the suicides, the thousands of people being forced to commit suicide, forced by the DWP to commit suicide, happened before that. So when the pandemic was mishandled from the beginning of this year, and it was mishandled by openly the government kind of sources saying openly that they needed the people to be experiencing the infection, the spread of the infection, in order, they said, the government and their so-called advisors said that in order to stop the virus spreading, more people had to be infected, and that would build, they claimed, the herd immunity, HERD. The herd immunity has not happened. And the herd immunity did not happen in the USA, where the numbers of people getting infected is rising. It didn't happen in India, where the official admission of the numbers of people infected has exceeded 9 million, which is a very large number, nearly a crore. And in fact, the unofficial number is well in excess of a crore, well in excess of 10 million people in India. So instead of looking at the relevance of the behavior of the government policy, or the conduct of the government policy, or the conception of the government policy, it is important to look underneath. What is the narrative? What's the agenda? What is it that they are trying to do? And it is very clear that overall, the government has been intentionally negligent at every stage. Intentionally negligent, uncaring, and cruel at every stage. And that intentional cruelty and negligence is directly related to the perpetuation of the persistence of the virus and its new strain or strains that are being now said to be out of control. The Financial Times' main headline is saying that markets, that is capitalist markets, fall as more nations, that is states, join UK travel ban over COVID variant. Talks to end border gridlock, and lorry drivers stranded. Supermarkets warn of shortages. We've covered all of those, especially the supermarkets, the Sainsbury's warnings. And we have said that Sainsbury's and other supermarkets were complicit in the propaganda for Brexit over 5 years. They should have said this before, because that is fact. The supermarket's warnings are based on the fact of the situation. And the Financial Times is silent on the homelessness crisis, but it is peddling the line for big business, pleading for more funds from the Johnson-fronted cabal. That is, they want more billions. And there is a piece about the USA, the measure to deal with the economic kind of impact of the virus are said to be insufficient. And the Financial Times has the headline in the second editorial, US stimulus package falls short of what is needed. And the first one, of course, is pandemic enters a new phase with virus variant. And the Financial Times has got propaganda for the pub. That the pub is, the use of the pub or the time spent in the pub is a good investment. And there are various contradictory and conflicting pieces in the Financial Times about the various rivalries and takeovers, etc., that are going on across the world. But these are not based on the needs of the people affected by the markets. That is the Financial Times. It's the imposing the lies and the denials of the big business on the majority of the people. And the Daily Mirror is saying that the mutant virus is already spreading across the UK and schools could shut and so on. And they're doing a propaganda for Keir Starmer, but it is not sticking. It is coming unstuck. The headline here, Britain in isolation, is factually, topically accurate, but it's not kind of taking it to the logical next stage, which is to correlate and connect it to the ideological narrative of Brexit and Brexiteers and the actual evidence of the cruelty of the mentality of the Tories and the Brexiteers and the lack of compassion and lack of actual sense of duty owed to the people, which duty has been neglected. If it had been actually observed and performed, then the entirety of the program about the dealing with the virus would have been different and the virus would have been controllable. As we have said, for 75 years, since the launch of the idea of the NHS, the necessary dynamic monitoring and auditing and researching of the conduct of whatever capacity the NHS has been having, that lack of continuous dynamic research, investigation, has been prompted by the ideology of the conservatives and the others who work as agents of big corporations and big pharmas and others. And that has starved what could have been the health service, what could have been the National Health Service, fit for service, fit for help at the point of need. It is not fit for help at the point of need. Now, by any calculation, the numbers of people that have been allowed to die as a result of the virus and the treatment, as a result of the type of treatment, lack of treatment, etc., is between 70 to 100,000 or even more. Most of these people should not have died, but they have been sacrificed by the corrupt, cruel, big business agenda operated by the conservatives for decades. And there is the kind of column by the Daily Mirror. It's an African origin person, and his role is not a role of being honest and opinionated. His role, for which he's been given the platform by the Daily Mirror, is to serve as a kind of nephew Tom. He's not going to say anything about racism, which is at the heart of the deaths of thousands of people of African and Asian origin in the last 11 months due to the pandemic. Due to the racism being practiced by the various stages of the care providers, so-called, they have not provided the care. And that failure and refusal and the fact of their not providing the care is directly linked to racism and racist prejudice. As we have been pointing out, the incident of the original nation's mother who was dying in hospital, and as she was dying, she was mocked by the nurses that were supposed to help her. That only came to be in the news because she was live streaming her state of health at the time that she was dying. So it's not like a secret. It happens every day in the NHS institutions. And it is something that is not addressed by the likes of Jeremy Corbyn either. Because Corbyn only talks about, quote, workers. He doesn't accept the concept that workers can be like those nurses in the American hospital. That workers can be deadly racist, literally deadly racist. And when the UK's so-called Equalities and Human Rights Commission did the racist investigation into Jeremy Corbyn, it failed. It failed to address racism in Jeremy Corbyn-led party. Racism that affects the majority of the people of victims of racism in this country. African people, Asian people, at every stage of society, every point of encounter and interaction between a racist and the targets. So therefore, it is not a kind of one-off. The fact that so many people are victims of racism every day is not a one-off. It's a continuous, persistent problem caused by racism, and it is not recognized as being of any consequence to human lives and the state of the quality of life of the people targeted by racists and affected by racist behavior. So what this particular statistic highlighted and brought to the fore, the large numbers and the disproportionate numbers of deaths of people of African and Asian origin, is that this is what is happening every day in every aspect of society, but not in a kind of capsule form as it was brought into the news focus because of the extraordinary focus on references to the vaccines, to the pandemic. They're not talking about the behavior of the thing, but they're talking about the existence of the thing, let's say. And they have not discussed the attitude of the care home personnel or care home nurses or NHS personnel that were in contact with allegedly their patients that they owed the obligation to fairly and equally respectfully treat. There is no statistics published about the numbers of African and Asian origin people being neglected by NHS staff and personnel on racial grounds and racial discrimination, and as part of the ongoing culture of negligence and discrimination and denial of equal service and treatment and devotion. There is no statistics. This is not even a subject for inquiry that has been even mentioned by any of the papers, including by The Guardian. So this is something that the Fleet Street kind of newspapers have been under a duty to investigate, but they haven't investigated. And here again, we have to refer to the National Union of Journalists and the Code of Conduct. What does the National Union of Journalists Code of Conduct actually oblige its active members to do? Whatever it says on paper is not implemented in real life, because we can see the NUJ member writers writing and staff editing and sub-editing and whatever, all these Fleet Street papers without any recognition of those duties and the Code of Conduct. And the same applies to the counterparts that work in the BBC and the Sky News, the ITV, Channel 4, and other broadcasting outlets in this country. And there is no regulation. Ofcom doesn't regulate, nor does anybody else regulate the actual conduct of the journalists. And journalism, as practiced by Fleet Street, is not reporting the truth. It's hiding the truth, covering up the truth, and manipulating the attention of the reader or the viewer or the listener, singular and collective and plural, away from the focus on the facts, on the reality. And it is a daily kind of defiance of the obligations of the UK institutions to practice and adhere to the requirements of the international treaties, charters, declarations, conventions that the UK remains an active member of. There is an acceptance that these are just formal kind of decorations, these charters, declarations, agreements, conventions. And that is why the newspaper headlines and the newspaper contents are completely irrelevant to those. Now the Boris Graph, which is the formerly called the Daily Telegraph, the Boris Graph, we call it the Boris Graph because this paper has, or the owners of this paper have bribed Boris Johnson to the tunes of millions of pounds from the start of his career as the then would-be mayor of London, would-be conservative mayor at the expense of London in 2007. He got in May 2008, but it was a year before that he launched his candidacy to become the candidate for the Conservatives to be the mayor of London at the expense of the London people. And what happened in the 12 years is that the Tory graph became a Boris graph because it became the platform which shamelessly promoted Boris Johnson as the conservative politician that needed the highest kind of position and posts. So they have been doing it for 12 years now. And the coverage of the government's behavior in relation to the behavior of the virus constitutes cover up. It's not covering as in reporting the truth, but it's hiding the truth. And it is such a brazen denial of the truth by the Boris graph that it doesn't see the irony of the headline that it carries like in Dover in Kent, it says, truck drivers sit in misery, fearing they won't be back in time for the turkey, that is Christmas. Now, if Brexit, which is the Tory graph actually, Boris graph madly promotes the Brexit, if Brexit was the panacea, the answer to Britain's economic ills before the pandemic made it worse, how is it that these Dover truck drivers are in misery? They should be euphoric They should be exciting and celebrating the fact that they're in a deadlock, that they're in a kind of, what is it, the truck. Let's see what the actual copy says. Faced with a closed port, chaos descends on Kent as lorries are stuck in laybys, possibly until Christmas. Lorries are stuck in laybys. Where are they going? Brexit meant that Britain was cut off from the continent, wasn't it? What on earth are they expecting to happen when actual Brexit is, to quote the lying, artificial, false claim by Boris Johnson, done? Even before it is done, they are stuck. Thousands and thousands of lorries are stuck in Kent, going for Europe or coming from Europe. Isn't that what they wanted? Taking back control. Taking back control meant reimposing lack, shortage. And it says that there is a shortage of tests being carried out because there is a shortage everywhere. And there is complete, absolute denial. Police failed to stop gang behind deaths of 39 migrants. That's the only kind of accurate headline in that Boris graph. And there is a piece about a woman called Christy Smith, a journalist with the Bloomberg News Agency, disclosed in 2005 how Martin Shkreli, dubbed the pharma bro for manipulating the price of medicine, was under investigation for trading violations. So she has left her job and her husband for this fraudster. And there is this lying propaganda that says that school should be kept open. And there is a piece blaming the French President Macron for the Dover crisis as well as for the European countries' ban on flights going out of the UK. And it says that Macron has been determined from the start to punish the UK for leaving the EU. Well, he may have had that determination, but what is happening now is nothing to do with his determination. It's to do with the virus spreading. And it's not just the French that have banned and stopped British vehicles entering or British passengers entering the French territories. It is all the other countries, 46 countries, according to the Daily Mail today, so far. And the I newspaper is saying that UK is sealed off from the world. It's not just 46 countries, but the whole world has sealed off UK. Now, again, how is that of any significance? Because Brexit surely must have brought the prospect of the world being completely abolished and scrapped by the UK, by the little Englanders. Why did they bother about the world? And the answer is because they're stupid. Brexit is stupid. And Brexit is the kind of symptom of the deeper stupidity that we have been uncovering and kind of updating on about the so-called leading nation of the world. I mean, they are not leading the world, are they? So the Murdoch scum, very reluctant to kind of identify Johnson as a failure, looks for any kind of excuse rather than his name being in the forefront of the headline or the splash. And while they are complaining about the French and the other countries in the EU shutting flights from the UK, this stupid scum with the liar, self-admitted liar, Shapps, Grant Shapps, who is an admitted, self-admitted liar and faker of his profile, who is now the so-called Secretary of State for Transport. Now, I mean, how did they find the serial incompetence and liars to be Secretary of State in this country? Chris Grayling, the failing crook, was there for too long, and now they have got another liar, Grant Shapps. And he's lying today in the Sun, as retailed in the Sun, says that no deal, just get over it. And they say, get over it. That is a kind of pun. They say, border shutdown shows UK ready. Can you believe this? They're complaining about border shutdown on every other page. And here they're saying the border shutdown shows the UK is ready. That means they're admitting in a double whammy of stupidity that the more shutdown, the better the British people would be. There would be no supply of fruits and vegetables. And there would be nothing. And that there would be nothing is already evident in the mad rush to empty the shelves. Now they are preaching to the people who will not be convinced by this preaching anyway. Because when the first kind of spread occurred in this country, say 10 months ago, 11 months ago, there were all these supermarket stores. The first thing that they lost in massive numbers were the toilet rolls. And the toilet rolls got empty, taken away, and the shelves are absolutely left empty. So they're saying that don't be selfish. There is no way that any of those people who took away all the toilet rolls will be convinced by this kind of preaching. So they will be doing it again. And the fact that they will be doing it again, and it is quite likely to happen, illustrates the point that Boris Johnson fronted cabal has not taken action in the last 9 months to prevent this kind of panic emptying of the shelves, nor indeed have the supermarkets themselves. So how can they be taking back control? And how does Grant Shapps interpret all of that as being a good thing? The answer is he can, because he is one of the lying morons that have been assuming that depriving people of basic necessities is a good thing. That is not governance at all. That is worse than the so-called banana republic. That is worse than the Lilliput people, the Lilliputians' behavior, and all the other variations and versions that could be confected and be invented and updated on about Lilliput and the Lilliputians. How can these people, Fleet Street so-called journalists and newspaper writers and editors, promote fundamentally, violently fundamentally contradictions and conflicts or conflicting accounts of what is going on? The answer is because they have been doing it for too long without the gullibles really noticing it. Well, the gullibles have been noticing it, but they have not been politically anywhere nearly as organized as they could be and they should have been. And the lack of that organization must be laid at the door of the Labour Party, which is numerically the biggest political party in the House of Commons, which is where the main parliamentary kind of identity lies. And it actually covers all the leaders of the Labour Party in succession. I mean, one of the rare things that is said about Harold Wilson is that he was a competent prime minister. Of course he was. But Wilson's premiership did not deliver the narrative that the society needs from the Labour Party or from any competent kind of party aspiring to be or aiming to be or claiming to be entitled to form the government of this country. And Wilson, who is credited with the idea of the Open University, Wilson's legacy is very limited in terms of enduring democracy and democratic accountability. And the fact that whatever the details, the fact that he suddenly resigned instead of explaining why he resigned, and that resignation has not been explained even up to this day, did not help the task of consolidating any legacy, pro-democratic, pro-accountability, pro-social, and caring legacy that he might have been assumed to have left as a an occupant of the office of Prime Minister in the name of the Labour Party. So Wilson failed, and his series of followers, who turned out to be electorally disastrous failures, including the racist James Callaghan and Michael Foot, and then Foot's preferred successor, the complete and utter crook Neil Kinnock, followed by, of course, John Smith, who was short-lived as leader, followed then by Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown. These people have not left behind an enduring, outstanding legacy of democratic accountability across the country, across the society in the UK. They have not. And the price of that failure by the Labour Party is being paid by the many. Remember the many? The many that Jeremy Corbyn claimed to speak for, claimed to be dedicated to serving. The many, despite the fact that they may or may not be electorally supportive of the Labour Party at all times, they are ordinary people of all backgrounds in this country. And they have not been given a leadership legacy. And they have not got a leadership example in Keir Starmer. He may say, as he has been saying in the last few days, reportedly, that Johnson left the kind of governance too late. The actions that should have been taken to deal with the virus were too late and too kind of ineffective, too useless, let's say. But Keir Starmer has been failing to maintain a running commentary, which he should have done, on the daily failures and disasters by and associated with the Johnson-fronted cabal of Brexiteering morons and liars and fakers. And the Fleet Street papers are silent about Keir Starmer's failure in the way that we are finding it. We are presenting it factually, evidentially, contextually, topically, and of course, morally, ethically, democratically, accountably, transparently. We are putting the analysis and the diagnosis before the viewer. Let's say viewer, just one viewer. Because we don't tout friends and we don't follow friends. Whoever may watch this in the most unusual way that is known for broadcasts. Because we don't have followers and friends, and we don't follow and have friends, it will be a small minority that would be watching this. But that is a matter of numbers. In terms of the contents and the quality and the uniqueness, it is absolutely unique and exclusive. And the value could not be higher in comparison with the rest of the offerings that can be accessed online in the present time. So this has been roughly about 2 hours. So we shall be coming back with part 3. This is part 2. So part 3 will follow in due course. This is Tuesday, the 22nd of December 2020, and the ending part 2 of the Khoodeelaar campaign coming from London, doing the world exclusive diagnosis of the British newspapers known collectively as Fleet Street.